Lander Graves, who is also a young scholar, can attest to this. I had the chance to learn from and receive feedback from so many kind, brilliant, supportive, creative professionals in the world of Black theater. And some of them are sitting among you today, and you know who you are. One lesson that I learned from being a young scholar, I could have multiple roles in Black theater. For instance, through BTN's Young Scholars Competition, I realized that these supportive individuals were engaged in research and publishing, but they also enjoyed careers as playwrights and educators, designers, actors, and directors. The Young Scholars Competition taught me that I did not have to choose one path. I was being prepared for many paths. I could study and write about and teach Black theater history and teach the roles of Black women in theater and performance, but I could also chart my own course as a freelance dramaturg. And so for nearly 25 years, I've worked off and on as a freelance dramaturg for theater productions throughout the U.S. BTN's Young Scholars Competition helped prepare me for my work within and beyond Black theater. It helped give me the tools to design study guides and toolkits for theater productions, curate lobby exhibits using archival materials, support playwrights through script development, offer research support to directors during table reads and production rehearsals, and lead post-show discussions. I share my story because I want to encourage you to see BTN Young Scholars Competition as an opportunity for you, a resource for one of your many paths. I'm a living testimony. One door can open so many other doors. And so all of us can do our part to support the next group of young scholars in Black theater. If you're an educator at college or university, or a director at a theater, encourage and mentor your students or interns, staff, to enter the next BTN Young Scholars Competition. Everyone can do their part. Share the notes with your network through social media, phone calls, emails, postcards, and definitely word of mouth. Enjoy the conference, and I hope that next year, some of you at this year's BTN conference will join the next cohort of BTN Young Scholars. I hope that you will now usher us into an amazing season of Black theater research. Be curious, be well, and thank you, BTN.
Thank you, Ms. Marta. Thank you, Dr. Marta Eppinger. So Dr. Eppinger is a full professor at CUNY University in New York City. So just to know and just to piggyback off of some of the things that she has said, I have my speech from Dr. Thomas, so I'm going to go through it quickly. But everybody is on the committees. So all of us are responsible to make sure that we let and help promote our Young Scholar program with BTN. Make writing a paper and an assignment for all of your classes. Download the flyer from the website or talk to anyone on the BTN board about getting the information so that you can copy it and email it to your students. Post it in your offices or nearby. Make a copy for the classes, talk about it, and if you're a director or an artistic director at an institution, you can choose a dramaturg from the university near you and tell that dramaturg to work on a paper or design for BTN. So keep those things in mind, please. And now, Jumbo, it's time for the S. Randolph Edmonds Young Scholar, Eric Gottlieb.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Eric Gottlieb, and I'm so glad I've been awarded the Young Scholar Award this year. Before I get into my presentation, I just wanted to say one really big thank you to Professor Elmo Terry Morgan, who was a formative influence on all of my research this entire year. He mentored me through every step of the process with this presentation, and I can't thank him enough for getting me where I am today. And with that, I'd love to get started on a bit of my research. So my paper is on Dyke Warrior Prayers, Sharon Bridgeforth's first play, and about something called the theatrical jazz aesthetic and how she implements it through text formatting. But before we get into what theatrical jazz is and what typography is, it's important to know what this play is about. Dyke Warrior Prayers speaks through 3 different narrators, and each narrator speaks from a different part on the page, each with a different typeface and a different text formatting. And through the cacophony of all of these perspectives, Bridgeforth ultimately makes an incredibly powerful and provocative piece. The themes concern subjugation, memory, race, and ritual, all come together to help people heal from their past trauma. The first pillar of my analysis has to do with theatrical jazz. And theatrical jazz is a pretty complicated concept, but I'll break it down into a couple constituent parts. First, it has to do with non-linearity. The lack of a clear beginning, middle, and end characterizes jazz pieces. Second, it has to do with simultaneity. Rather than having discrete characters, times, places, and events, jazz playwrights like to coalesce multiple characters and perspectives all together to make a richer whole. Third is about collectivity. Jazz playwrights are about communality. They care about coming together and resolving their problems with each other rather than taking on the burdens of the world just by themselves. Next is about fluidity. In the same way that a jazz piece is characterized by improvisation and constant movement and rhythm, jazz playwrights do the exact same by switching between different aesthetics and changing how they present their pieces. Second to last has to do with catharsis, or purgating toxic emotions that people have accrued over a lifetime. And last but not least, theatrical jazz is about queerness. And while this is a loaded term, I think it's important to recognize that queerness in this context refers to a transgression against social norms to reclaim personal authenticity and hopefully become a better person. The second part of my analysis has to do with typographic theory. And before we get into that, it's important to know, well, what is typography? Long story short, it's just text formatting. It's font, it's white space, it's how much length and difference between words we put on the page. Typography is about dynamism. It's about creating movement on the page. By putting different words at different margins and different text weights and different styles, we can literally create art and visual images through the page. But it also has to do with rhythm. The places we put text on a page can create a musical score on paper. And third, it has to do with communication. These two things can come together to create a new communicative register, and that can ultimately enhance the play itself. So my research has 2 fundamental questions. The first is, how does Bridgeforth typographically utilize the jazz aesthetic? And second, what does its use accomplish thematically? And my answers come in just as many parts. First, I look at font choice. And second, I look at visual motion to see how Sharon Bridgeforth ultimately strengthens the aesthetic of our piece through something that most of us often overlook each and every day. So let's start with the fonts. I identified each of the fonts by pasting them into Google Docs and then keeping the format afterwards. I was able to identify a strict set of different typefaces that Bridgeforth could have used. And then afterwards, I determined what their histories were and also the social relevance of each and every one of them. I'll start with the first typeface. This is one everyone knows, it's Ariel. But I think something that we don't know is that Ariel is a split personality. Ariel used to be the typeface of advertisers. It used to be plastered on billboards all throughout American cities. It was the mainstream. But at the same time, it was also seen as something dishonest. It was seen as something that copied Helvetica. Each and every stroke of Ariel was almost pixel for pixel the exact same as Helvetica. And for that reason, it had a terrible reputation attached to it. But at the same time, it's also semi-formal. This refers to Edward Kadich's typology of type. All he says is that text can be formal, semi-formal, and informal. Formal is like a Times New Roman. It exudes professionalism. Semi-formal is like an Ariel. It's standard, but it isn't as professional and flourished as a Times. And informal is just everyday handwriting. Semi-formality is different than formality because it cares about exuberance and freedom. It cares about creating a typeface that isn't constrained to the confines of professionalism. And in that way, Ariel is both mainstream, but it also is opposed to the mainstream. What's interesting is when we look at this exact same passage, we can see an entirely different story in Bridgeforth's play. We see a tension. We see contrasting form versus content, a mainstream figure conveying revolutionary ritual and communal solidarity. We also see it as a way to carry authentic expression, a way for people to purgate their toxic emotions through an everyday form of communication. But third has to do with potential. It's a way for people to exist under the confines of everyday speech, a way for people to don the guise of what hurts every day, and instead use that to heal. But that brings us to the second typeface. Something most of us probably haven't heard is a typeface called a body. And that's exactly it. It's very obscure. It's an unknown, almost anonymous typeface. But if we look at it just from an aesthetic perspective, we see that it's thin, delicate, almost naive in a way. Notice the monosyllabism of this passage. The narrator has much shorter sentences, much shorter line lengths. And in a way, this typeface also reinforces that message. It's thin, delicate, unknown. It doesn't have the same social histories attached to it, like an Ariel or Times New Roman. But let's look at a body again through the jazz perspective. We can see that it's freed of historical commitment. It's not the same as an Ariel. It hasn't been around for decades. It isn't seen on everybody's Microsoft Word processor. Instead, it's a conscious choice to use a different aesthetic medium in her play. At the same time, it also emphasizes heritage. It's part mainstream, it's a semi-formal typeface, but at the same time, it's anonymous. In that way, Bridgeforth is able to almost project her own history onto the text. She says, I don't care what the social histories of these texts are. I'm going to reinvent what this means, and I'm going to choose a specific new aesthetic medium to convey my ritual. But let's head to the last typeface, Times New Roman, something everybody's probably hating because they had to use it in MLA papers in high school, and I personally have to use all the time at school. But it represents elitism. Times New Roman came from the Times of London. It used to represent an elitist typographic culture where being able to read and write was seen as a mark of the aristocracy. In that way, Times is more of an absence of a choice rather than a choice. It's what we defaultly choose. Saying I'm going to use Times New Roman is more like saying I didn't really choose a font. I just chose what everyone tells me I should choose. And in that way, it also is an interesting play on temporality. The word time itself has to do with multiple coalescing times and perspectives, and Bridgeforth plays with that masterfully. But let's look once again through the jazz perspective. Times New Roman shows another tension between form and content. Times is as mainstream as it comes, but Bridgeforth uses it to convey something that's incredibly not mainstream. It emphasizes improvisation, that even when donning the mask of professionalism and everyday speech, people are still able to convey their own authentic emotions. They can still create a ritual, come together, and face collective trauma. But in that way, it's still formal. It still uses different coterminous narratives. It is time itself. And for that reason, Times New Roman is a contradiction. It's about formality, but it expresses something that's incredibly personal and informal at its core. But let's head to the next part of this presentation, which is about visual motion. Let's look at a sentence, we love eating pineapples. Everyone's seen that, left to right, one space between every word. But ask yourself, how does that reading change when we add space between them, when we change the amount of distance between every word? We love eating pineapples. Your eyes have to dart around the page a lot more. Maybe you read pineapples before love, or you read love eating before we. The point is that when we don't do standard left to right reading, it makes it a lot harder for us to really take into account and understand what a text is saying. And as I'll get to later, that creates a sense of uncomfortability that Sharon Bridgeforth masterfully changes throughout her play. But let's look at another example from Ntozake Shange. She does the exact same thing. She makes a literal chasm of white space between sing and make, again emphasizing the distance between these two words and creating a new meaning from the whole. Visual motion has three fundamental tenets. The first is about comfort. When you're reading a book, you expect there to be a certain amount of white space between every word. You expect there to be a certain number of words per page. But when you change that, like Bridgeforth does, it makes the reader a bit more uncomfortable. It's harder for you to take in the meaning of the passage when it's constantly being changed and thrown around. At the same time, visual motion is also about rhythm. It lets us literally make a musical score on the page, putting different parts all throughout the page, playing with visual motion, and ultimately oscillating between where the words go. But ultimately, it's a form of experimentation. It allows playwrights like Sharon Bridgeforth to forge their own grammars, to say that these words ought to be seen as one by taking away a white space, or that these words are entirely unrelated by creating a lot of white space. In that way, Bridgeforth is ultimately manipulating how people read her play through something that we usually forget about when we read it. So let's look at some examples. Left center, right. That's a standard narration from this play. But she changes that up a plenty amount of times throughout the play. Sometimes she'll go left, center, left. Or another time she'll go left, right, left. Ultimately, Bridgeforth is experimenting with where the words go on the page. It's a musical, it's rhythmic, it's an improvisational medium. Think of it like call and response. Each narrator is saying something to the other, making it more a conversation than a monologue. And when we look at it as a conversation, not a monologue, we can see that Bridgeforth's entire thesis has to do with turning individual struggles into something that's communal. The leftmost narrator is going through their trauma, and they speak to the rightmost narrator. The rightmost narrator speaks back, and so does the center one. Bridgeforth is emphasizing how communality is important to overcoming one's personal struggles. And she does that through text alignment. She makes a literal chasm between each narrator, and she uses that to create a prayer, a ritual that ultimately lets them overcome their struggles. So at the end of the day, Bridgeforth's jazz is about healing. It's about solidarity, and it's about community. All of her typographic choices connect individual struggles to something bigger and something more communal, so that they could be overcome in the long run. Future work in this field can go into 4 categories. First has to do with location. We could look at different socioeconomic contexts, different histories, not just the United States. Second has to do with time frame. We can expand the chronology. Bridgeforth's play is just from the later half of the 20th century, but we could go back further in time, or even look at right now. Third has to do with typography. We don't just have to look at fonts or visual motion. There are plenty of other things in typography that can be analyzed. And finally, it has to do with authorship. Sharon Bridgeforth isn't the only jazz playwright who does this, and dozens of others have as well. And it would be an amazing conversation to talk about them too. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Eric, so much. Yeah, we really appreciate that. And I want you all to know that Eric is just a freshman. So we're not going to, your Omar Oshun Joni Jones had a presentation to present to him to talk about his work and what he did, but it's a little bit long for the time frame that we have. So we're going to send that to you so that you'll be able to share it and bask in that. And Joni Jones is a former BTN officer that has been with us for a very long time. So we're hoping that any of you all that may have comments for Eric and any of the other scholars that are going to be presenting tonight, if you'll see them throughout the conference in the hallway, that you'll make comments to them, share your thoughts with them so that they can have feedback. That's one of the most important things. And if you want to sign, make a comment and give it to us, we'll make sure that they get it as well. So with that, we want to go in and present to Eric his award and his gift from BTN. So Eric. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, just because of time, we're going to keep going. So I'm going to turn, we would also like to thank the judges of the Young Scholars Competition, Dr. Judith Stevens, right over here, retired full professor, Dr. Sandra Adele, a full professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and managing editor of the Black Review Journal, and Corey J. Roberts, doctoral student at University of Arizona. That one made the committee along with Dr. Lindina Thomas. So thank you for your time and support and commitment and volunteerism. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Timothy Jones.
Thank you. Today I'm presenting the winners of the Judy Deering Student Design Competition. We have 4 winners, one in costume, scenery, lighting, and sound. We have 3 winners here today and one who was unable to make it, but she is standing by on Zoom, and we're gonna let her go first, okay? So just let me get connected, and then we'll see if we can get her. Oh, that's the issue. Yeah. Okay. Brittany, can you hear me?
Yes.
Brittany, Brittany, can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yep. Brittany, can you hear me?
Did you hook up the sound?
I did. I did hook up the sound. Oh, I see her. Can you hear me, Brittany? Can you wave? You can hear me? All right, go ahead.
Are you sharing the audio too?
Let's make sure I'm sharing the audio.
No problem. So it should be in your advanced, like here. If it's not, you can go to preferences and go to audio. It's coming in. Advanced capture sound.
We just need to turn it up.
Maybe. Let's see. Hold on. Here, is your computer volume up? We can hit exit here. So, there we go. So, let's try it.
Can you try it now, Brittany? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, there you go. All right, great.
Okay. Okay. Let me know when you're ready.
You're ready. You're up.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Hello everyone, my name is Brady Travis. I'm currently presenting in Los Angeles, California. I thank God for grace in my life with so many wonderful opportunities, and I'm very appreciative of the opportunity to present my costume design work today. Thank you to Jones, the selection committee, and the members of the Black Theater Network for selecting me for the 2022 Judy Daring Design Competition Award in Costume Design. I'm very grateful to be here via Zoom. So I'll share just a little bit about me. I'm from Indianapolis, Indiana. I go to school at the College Conservatory of Music, University of Cincinnati. This year, I'll be a third-year MFA Costume Design and Technology grad student. I'm also a grad assistant, and I work in the costume shop, and this upcoming semester, I'll be a TA, and then I graduate in spring 2023. In school, I tailored my course of study to touch all aspects of like theatrical work, and recently I've introduced film and television into my costume work. I've worked in design, assisting, illustration, costume construction, pattern making, draping, aging, stressing, dyeing, crafts, wardrobe. And then here's just like some examples of some of the work that I've done in school, or just like independent projects by myself. My previous athletic costumes and my previous background, I've been awarded at the Kennedy Center American College Theater Festival for excellence in costume design, and I received the inaugural Collier Robert Bush Jr. Scholarship at USITT. And then currently, which is the reason why I'm in LA, is I'm finishing my 8-week costume design internship at the Television Academy Foundation. I've been interning on film, been on 2 TV shows, and visiting a lot of the costume hotspots here with my host Terry Gordon, just learning about new aspects of costuming while I do the theater aspect at school. My first design that I'll present on is titled Blue Stockings. It's set at Curtin College in 1896. It is about 4 young women fighting for education and self-determination against the larger backdrop
of women's suffrage. So I started on research by just finding factual imagery of students that were at Cambridge during the time period. And my design approach was to embrace the idea of vivid self-discovery, traditional 1890s academia and philosophies, and the use of period accurate silhouettes, a simplistic approach to trend and ornamentation, and a controlled color palette with a selective print and pattern selection to evoke the feeling of individuality within a structured environment. So my factual costume research, I did a wide net of people during the period, upper class women and men, school-age boys and girls, and I was looking for the similarities that I could have since they were in school. So I didn't really want a uniform type of look, but I wanted uniformity within all of the clothes they wore and the overall silhouette. I also had subtle differences to give each character to make their own identity, to give them their own identity. So even like with the males, just giving certain like different aspects that you see in the pictures. For the evocative research, I collaborated with the director to try to just get input on the costumes, the pops of color, to resemble, to blend to, like, bring a light with that parchment paper setting, because it has like a very abstract design, so I had to be very historically accurate, and I wanted to use color to display those nuances of the character. And then I chose prints and patterns that would psychologically read as academic or scholastic. I chose flags and gingham stripes so that the objects would connect with the characters and just be a visible indicator that these characters were in school. And then here are a few of my renderings. The colors are just on like a spectrum. The women who believed in equality and had a space to voice it wore the colors of the greens and yellow and the pinks. And then the male and the female identifying characters who were against equality and whose voices were suppressed had clothing that lacked color, or they wore the purple and blacks. I had one build for the show that was 3 custom-made pieces, a jacket, a vest, and a skirt. So I talked to the draper fitter that I wanted her character to be very intimidating and soft, so we worked together and I made some flats, and then we went along and started building the costume for this character. Just quickly going through it, I had a lot of double casting in the show, so a lot of female characters that had to be male, or had to go from male to female, so I had to display that, which you'll see in the final photos for the show, just touching on it briefly. That was something that I had to take these 16 characters and show the different classes and the different ranks, and have these female characters go back and forth if they were playing a lower status character or higher status character, and even that with the boys showing different class status. So these were the production photos at the end. And this is the credit of all the collaborators that I worked with for this project and the performance. And then my second project was CCM Idea Lab. This was a collaborative cross-disciplinary class that explored artistic, technical, and philosophical questions through the creation of short performance pieces. So something that was interesting was time and how it affects people. So I didn't have a budget for the show, so we had to figure out how can we tell a story of time just with what we we had. So my design statement was to showcase different time periods from a span of 100 years. We picked 4 time periods that were used with one character that was supposed to be a fantasy character who's being projected on. So my one requirement was that had to have white or beige clothing. And so I had to keep it in perspective my time management. I was doing the clothing and the research of fitting and alterations by myself. I had to get everything done and ready to go for the shoot day. So these are the pieces that I pulled and fit on the performers. And then so, like for Sean, his character was from the 1970s, so I based items, I pulled the items that I could source first, went back, found costume pieces or just fashion from the 1970s. I knew because of my budget, it may not be period accurate, but I was going for something that represented the period or could have both the look. And so this is what it ended up looking like on the final day. And then this is my collaborators again, the production team, and then the performers that I work with. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Buffini. We'll get back in touch with you later. All right? Bye. All right. Our next presenter will be our sound designer. I just want to note that this year is the first year that we've actually had a sound designer in the competition. So we're really happy that we were able to get a good winner this year. So let me introduce you to State of just put it right on top. Okay.
Interesting. Okay. Let's try again this part. There we go. Awesome. Hello, everyone. My name is Tahida Tate Abdullah. I am going into my second year of grad school at Carnegie Mellon University, and I am studying sound design. So what I'm going to show today. So what I'm going to show today are 2 different productions. The first production is called Little Black Boys Don't Go Outside. That was a show that was written and directed by my friend Candace James. Also had the assistant director Joshua C. Wyatt. The lighting designer was Ernest Wong. The costume designer was Gregor Labuda. The stage manager was Gabrielle Harper. The video designer was Kat Ashley. And the sound designer was me, Tahida Abdullah. This show was part of our playground piece. So we have a week at CMU where it's just student plays that we go and put on and produce with, like, in the short amount of time that we can. Unfortunately, because of COVID, we weren't able to put any of the shows that were all done up, but this was a fully collaborative process that was between our first year grad cohort. So, which is really cool about it because it had people from basically from around the world, and also all of us working together as friends trying to create a piece. So this play is a short play. It's about 10 pages long, and it is about the killing of a young black boy that my friend Candace James wrote. Candace is also black. And so it's dealing with a mother, a son, her name is Marva, her youngest son's name is Sonder, and her oldest son's name is Daniel. And Daniel a scene in memory as he got shot and killed way back when. And so we see the memory of Daniel, and so she's very protective over Sonder. And then the play goes on as he's trying to go outside, and it's taking place in the summer, and it's supposed to happen either before George Floyd's death or after George Floyd's death. So it's a very serious piece, and we all took a lot of care into it, and we're really thinking about it, especially everything going on in the country at the time. And so I was working really closely with the director and playwright Candace about what we wanted things to sound like and how we wanted to go about that. And so I settled on the idea of, okay, well, let's make music for it. Instead of focusing on making actual sound effects, it was more about what instruments kind of fit with these three characters on stage as it's this heightened time in the summer. And I, instead of going for something more electronic, which you'll see in the other show, this one I wanted to go more acoustic and to feel a bit more real and very like bare bones and more emotional and sentimental. So for Marva, I decided to use the piano for the depth of range that she has with suffering. And she is the oldest character and has lived the longest. And she's looking at everything through a historical lens of all the events that have happened past and also what she fears in the future. So because of that, also having a more mature sound gave her the piano. Daniel has the cello as he's the older brother, but also he does suffer. We don't ever get to see him beyond him being on stage. And we don't get to hear him talk, basically. So that having the cello does also have a more mature sound than the guitar, but there is a bit of warmth there. And that he is playing with Sonder, and he is there. We see that connection. And so that led to Sonder being represented with an acoustic guitar, having his youth. He has all this youth. He's excited. He wants to get out into the world. He doesn't understand what's going on. And also musically, for the summer, like having a guitar, it's a thing you think about of like being outside in the field and lake and playing by the tree and being with your friends. And that's all he wants to do, is to be with his friends and to be with other people. And so these are a bit of examples of the music composition. So I decided to go with things that sounded more melancholy, or kind of building on those ideas of like, oh, some of the, as even if songs build up and it starts to sound a little lighter, we start to end on like either dissonance or we end unfinished, and because everything does feel unfinished and you never get the resolution, you never get the full happiness that is expected at the end of the play, that everyone so much wants. So I'm gonna play a couple examples. Great, so that's just an example of the opening sequence as they're playing outside, and then we go into that. So then you can see this is just an example of the cue sheet, just labeling things, the important parts that we have. So going into the next show. So this show is called The Hit Dog Will Holler. It was written by Inda Craig Galvan. We were very happy that we were able to put on a new work at CMU. And so this show was directed by Joshua C. White. The dramaturg was Sammy Paul. The lighting designer was Jess Winward. The scenic designer was Natalie Islami. The costume designer was Emily Marshburn. The video designer was Bahar Esfahani. And the sound designer was me, Tanya Abdullah. So A Hit Dog Will Holler is a really cool show. It's very conceptual, and it's very reliant on the media and the sound design for this production. So it is about two Black women. One of them is gay, one of them is straight. Gina is the straight Black woman, and she's an activist, and a social media activist primarily, fighting for rights, and the show takes place in the time of January 2020, going up until the summer of 2020. She is agoraphobic, which means she does not go outside And that is due to an incident that happened that's mentioned at a rally 4 years ago that has kept her locked inside. And she hears this monstrous noise. Every time she opens up the door, it fills her house, it fills her head, and she cannot escape it. Drew is a boots-on-the-ground activist. His DoorDash is not on social media except for Twitter. And she thinks Gina is being crazy, thinks Gina doesn't know what's going on, and tries to create a friendship, tries to be with her, and then she too starts to hear the noise. And so the monster is the third character, which is played by sound. And it is through the integration of technology, which is the integration of like how it's showing up in their phones and showing up on the TV and showing up around them. And so a really cool thing I wanted to do was, this was done in a video studio. So it's just a 50 by 50 space. And so I decided to go for a full surround sound experience in there. So we had giant subs. We had subs around the audience. They were sitting in an alley seated way. And there was speakers above everyone. And so to go through this, so the first aspect in the triangle was technology. And so it was trying to have a really technological electronic soundscape. I really like electronic music. I really like production beats and stuff, so that was really cool. And so that used, I only used a synthesizer for this, and I also used plugins. So I kept it very restrained in what I was using sonically. Then this second part was using Black artists to kind of emphasize and put people into the world of Black soundscape, of Black music, Black people. And so that was really important for the audience to have to be in that and sit in that with everyone else. Whoopsie. And then the other part was Black activists. So that is the sound. That is everything that we hear inside of their heads, inside of Gina, when we're going in between different moments, you know, hearing people talk about what's going on. And also in the show, they mention a fake killing of a teenager that is by Sandra Davis. So that is a framing device that goes on throughout about what do you do when you're faced with these things. And so everything goes on about the idea. The monster represents oppression. The monster represents society. It represents everything that goes on inside and affects you. And that's really what we wanted to focus on in the show. And so this is the boring stuff, which is a system and paperwork, but you can see that there's speakers around, and we had to use an analog system setup. Cue sheet, it's very a lot. There was integrated media, so a lot of my cues also had to go with video. And yeah, so I will play one of the songs, one of the pieces right now. And so this is the prologue, Gina's prologue monster, which starts to show she's laying on the couch, and then she wakes up and is terrified. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it. Fantastic.
Oh, yeah. Hey?
Yes, sir.
Michael.
Yeah.
So can I give you your reward?
Oh, yeah, that's right. Sorry. Ah.
Mr. Tom.
Oh.
Oh. I should hold on, sir. There you go.
Hey, there you go.
While you're photographing, next person set up, please. Thank you. While you're photographing, next person on deck, please.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You don't need the sound, right? your display. There we go.
Yes. Yay. Sorry, Ms. Lane.
Okay. All right.
Okay, cool. Okay, cool. Hello, everyone. My name is Moira McCall. I'm one of the Judy Deering Student Design Competition winners of 2022. I'm going to be presenting on lighting today. I'm a recent graduate of Columbus State University, where I got my undergrad and I got my undergrad and BFA Design and Technology. And so we'll go ahead and get started. My first show that I'm presenting is Pipeline by Dominique Morrison, who I'm sure all of you are very well aware of. Within this show, the director was David McRae, assistant director was Gabrielle Solomon and Lauren Alexandra. The scenic designer was Tim McGraw and Emma Wigington. Lights were by me. Sound was by Crystal Kennel and Mari Bogucki. And then costumes were by Steve Graver. So this is some research images that I have that reminded me sort of the show when I was coming up with the concept and the lighting concept. We came into the room in our production meeting and the director presented his concept, which had a lot of East Coast rappers, sort of underground poetry slam type of vibes, which is really what I wanted to emulate within my design. This was our first production coming back from COVID. So we had to do all of our productions in our main stage space, which is a very large space. And we all felt that this show was very intimate. If you're not familiar with Pipeline, it goes through the story of Naya and Omari. Omari has just been kicked out of school because he pushed a teacher down. He's a Black boy. And so it's sort of going through the motions of what does that mean? Does he go to trial? Like how will that work out for his future as well? And Naya, his mother, it also sort of follows her. She's a teacher. And so she sort of has panic attacks about what will happen to Omari if he continues down this path. So I sort of felt like the show was very intimate. And the question that we had was, how do we make this intimate show in this vast space? How we answered it was by building our set out into the audience. Which sort of limited a lot of lighting capabilities of myself, but I do think that I overcame that. So to get into the research images, this first image right at the top of there is called Black Children Keep Your Spirits Free, and it's by Carolyn Mims. It was featured in Nation. I really enjoyed this piece specifically just because of all of the colors that were incorporated. It has a lot of, the phrase Black children keep your spirits free were repeated a lot within the piece. And it sort of reminded me of this underground sort of thing. Sort of similar with Revolutionary. This is an image at the bottom down here of Angela Davis. And this is by Jarrell Wadsworth, which was also featured in Nation as well. And of course it has respect and a lot of other quotes by Angela Davis within that. So I really liked keeping this poetry and the flow and the rhythm of the show within it. And I think Dominique Morrison, in a lot of her shows, poetry is very important within that. So yeah, moving on. Here's an example of the lighting plot. It is a little bit hard to read from all the way up there, but we're gonna skip past that a little bit. An example of the cue sheet as well. And then I have some production photos of how this turned out. Since this was a COVID show, we did have a double cast, so some of these people are not quite the same in all of the photos, but it is the same production. I know, it's very dark. Up in the top left, we have sort of an example of the teacher's lounge, and then there are multiple locations within this show as well. The teacher's lounge, Omari's girlfriend's dorm room, Omari's house, and then also the teacher's classroom. And in the middle, we had the undefined space, which within the text is sort of whatever you want it to be. We sort of made it into a vacuumless sort of like void to be within Naya and Omari's mind. They sort of haunted each other within these voids. And that's how we did that. Here are some more pictures. And of course, I'd be willing to show these to anybody after this presentation because it's a little bit light with the light, so it's hard to see, but I'm perfectly willing to show those to people. Moving on, we have Mr. Burns, a post-electric play by Anne Washburn. This is just a mock-up design, so there's no production team except for really myself. So we're gonna move on. Within Mr. Burns, it sort of takes place in this post-apocalyptic type of era, right after sort of maybe a nuclear disaster perhaps, and there are these people who are living in the woods currently trying to figure out what exactly they would like to do. Within the first act, they're all gathered around a fire, which I really wanted to play on the aspect of the fire being their only light. As they're going around and talking, oh great, as they're going around and talking around the fire, they recall the story of Mr. Burns from The Simpsons. It is an episode, and I believe it's called Cape Fear. Yay! That's great. Awesome. An episode called Cape Fear from The Simpsons, and they're recalling this episode going through what they remember from the times when technology was still around. Great. When technology was still around. And so I sort of like the idea of the fire being their only light, like the story of Cape Fear, of the Simpsons episode, is their only grip for humanity in this post-apocalyptic world where everybody is sort of dead or, just scattered about. So I really like playing on the fire being their center of gravity, their center of the stage, and also the darkness around them. What does that mean for them to be in the dark, by themselves, isolated? And there is a character, her name escapes me right now, but there is a character who sort of stays like on the edge of the dark, and she does some other things in Act 2. So in Act 2, it takes place on an empty soundstage, sort of warehouse type of area. Of course, we're still in this post-apocalyptic universe, so there is no power, no light. They're sort of putting on this production of the Simpsons episode of Cape Fear. So they get the lights and the sound, and they make pretty much this entire production of this like a TV show, essentially. And so within this production, I sort of wanted daylight to be their lights. I wanted, streams of daylight coming in. I wanted it to feel sort of industrial, kind of cold, like there's no warmth, there's no humanity. They're distorting the story, and that's sort of what happens throughout the show, is that they distort the story, or, they script the flip of the story. So you go throughout the show. So I really wanted to incorporate that into this design, this sort of disarray of everything. Moving on to Act 3. And within Act 3, we are 75 years past this post-apocalyptic event. So within this time, they are still putting on this production of Mr. Burns. And as time has gone on, they still don't have electricity, no power, no anything. And it's taking place on sort of this pageant boat type of situation. My idea for this is sort of in compilation with the set design, is to create an almost encrusted boat, like a sunken ship, in which everything would sort of come together. And it sort of reminded me of a junkyard sculpture. So there would be lights sort of like encrusted within these, which would sort of be like practicals, I suppose. I would like to use a hazer to sort of create some fog as well. At the end of the show, Mr. Burns gets on a bicycle, starts to pedal, and the electricity comes back on. Within that moment, I would like for everything to light up. Which is sort of why I had the idea of the junkyard sculpture, to tie it all together. Like a sunken ship, there's a certain beauty within a sunken ship, and there's also a tragedy there. So there's a beauty within humanity going on, but there's also a tragedy because it's over. And they're going into a new type of situation. So here's my plot for Mr. Burns. This was for the Goodman Theater in Chicago, is the place where I sort of made this mock-up of this design. And then an example of a magic sheet, and that is it for my presentation, but yay! And I can sort of go back to the pipeline pictures if you'd like. Okay. That's cool.
Get out of this. Didn't do it.
And let me see. I think I remember what the keystroke was earlier. Yeah.
Where was
Mine is that one here. Yeah. Thank you. Hey, everybody. My name is Brandy Alexander. I'm a third-year scenic design MFA student at the University of Houston, and scenic design winner of the Judy Deering Student Design Competition this year. I have so far designed a total of 3 shows. I'm going to show you 2 of them today. So the first show is Picnic by, I got to keep my hands out, the Picnic by William Inge. The director was Brandon Weinbrenner. Set design was by me. Lighting design was by Nina Saunders. Sound design was Andrew Lynch. Costume design was Amber Stepanik. And this was at the Lyndall Finley Wortham Theater at the University of Houston. Picnic is about 2 families. They live next door to each other. They share a front yard, and it covers like a week of time and conflicts that happen between them. For a conversation, like something that came up in conversations with the director was just the idea of like the difference between how people act before they enter a room and like once they have entered a space, like when we don't think people can see us versus when people can see us and the ways that we adjust ourselves. And so after those conversations, my process so far looks like one where I like read the script, have conversations, and then go sit in like a library or something and flip through picture books and see what happens. And I just take pictures of everything and then get it all in front of me and then find like the thread from there. So this is just some of the research that I gathered for this show. Things that ended up being like the through line were, you know, the idea of like seeing through and like portals. And also the show takes place in like the American Midwest. So being all like Midwestern and it's rural, like it's a rural town in the American Midwest. So this is some of my research. And then I got into like a sketch model, which is what this is. And then the final look is this. This is some production photos. So we went with like I went with a painted backdrop just to give the environment. And then because the whole play happens in this one space, the entire place happens in the yard between these 2 houses. And on the houses, instead of putting like material on the walls, like on the exteriors, it's like the exposed 2x4 frames of the houses. And then we had an abundance of this like cloth in our storage that we painted to look like sideboarding on homes, but you could see through it. So there was this really interesting thing where actors could be like before, even not like in the doorway, but also like before they entered the doorway, you could see people before they entered and after they exited. Yeah, and this is some more production photos. And then this is just some of my drafting for it. And then I put fake grass on the stage, but then I had to figure out the wear patterns on it. So this is just me figuring out the wear patterns on the grass that we had on stage. And then the next show is Silence by Moira Buffini. For this one, our director was Josh Morrison. Set design was by me. Lighting design was not by Christina Gianelli. That is a mistake on my part. It was by Nina Saunders. Sound design was by Andrew Lynch and Brandon Cho. Costume design was by J.P. Riddle. And this was in the Quintero Theater at the University of Houston, which is our black box. And Silence is a play that we did in the black box, but it goes to like a lot of locations. I think it goes to like 9 locations. And so we took a modular approach with Silence, and everything was, we took like a minimal modular approach. And the play is about class, gender identity, paganism, duality, and Christianity. And so I was really inspired by the medieval architecture of Norway and England. And so we decided on a series of like 3 arches, and they were all on casters and completely movable. And there's like 2 church pews that have back on them, and then 2 backless benches. And so we took those with 7 scenic pieces and used those in different orientations to create our environments. This is some of my research for Silence. And how I got to the arch thing was just, they just were, thank you. They were everywhere in all of my research. And what ended up being, the image here in the center is kind of what ended up being the one that I clung to as I finalized my design. And then this was my sketch model, just thinking about arches and like projection surfaces, because our lighting designer was really enthusiastic about like playing with light and imagery on something outside of the arches. And then here are some production photos. The one on the top right, you can kind of see how one of the locations was a borrow. So you can kind of see we like put them in order from like biggest to smallest, and created like a depth. And then here's some of my design package where I figured out the different orientations to put them in. And here is where I rendered it in 3D. Because that is something that I have learned how to do, that I'm very proud of. Yeah, and that's my presentation. Do you have any questions? I think I have a few minutes. Should we do questions? Okay, sweet.
I'm gonna call you. I'm gonna talk to you later. I got stuff.
Okay, sounds good.
I think we will see you later.
Okay.
So we can have all the, you can turn those lights, turn the lights on.
Oh my goodness. Look at that.
I'm sorry. I can't see. Y'all can still out of the picture if I'm putting it together.
You want to drop your mask just for a second?
Oh, yeah, there you go.
Look at the come on, Eric.
Really good job. Good job.
Hold it, please.
Thank you.
The future of Black
Yes.
Thank you. One more.
Man, I thought you were done. I'm sorry.
We want to be sure we get it right.
Did they get the audio with the McDonald's card? Pardon?
They're proud.
Everybody got it?
Everybody got a McDonald's card.
Okay, we got it both ways.
So thank you guys very much, and congratulations to all of our young scholars. We appreciate that. Thank you to each and every one of you that stayed. The next sections have already started. You can join us in the process, and we appreciate you being here at the BTN conference. You can take time to do that. Thank you, yes. Thank you, Mr. Tim. I'm so sorry. I know, but I'm so sorry. You did